December 17th, 1943. Christmas Eve is 1 week away. But in this English village there are no Christmas lights. No children are laughing. No smoke from chimneys. Because 7 days ago, 150 people just vanished. Their government made them disappear forever. And the truly insane part? Their village is still empty today, 80 years later, still forbidden, still being used for the exact same purpose that stole their lives. This is the story of Imber, the village Britain sacrificed and never gave back. But here's what's interesting. The residents were promised they would be home in 6 months. That was 29,000 days ago. Stay with me, because what happened to Imber reveals the most shocking truth about how far governments will go when they want something badly enough. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why this temporary evacuation became the longest military occupation of a civilian village in British history. Let me take you back to 1943. Picture a village so remote, so untouched by modern life, that it could have been from a fairy tale. Imber had survived everything history could throw at it. The Black Death of 1348? Imber endured. The English Civil War? Imber survived. The Industrial Revolution that killed off hundreds of villages? Imber adapted. This was not just any village. Families like the Hilliers had been farming the same land since the 1400s. By the 1931 census, this had fallen to just 152. But these were not just residents, they were living history. But there was a problem brewing that would change everything. Since 1897, the War Office had been quietly buying up Salisbury Plain around Imber. By the 1920s, they owned the farms. By 1943, they owned almost everything except 5 buildings. By the time of the Second World War, almost all of the land in and around Imber, except the church, vicarage, chapel, schoolroom, and the Bell Inn, belonged to the War Office. The villagers had become tenants in their own ancestral homes, but they believed they were safe. After all, why would anyone want to destroy something so beautiful? Then came November 1st, 1943. D-Day was coming, and the military had a problem. Before we continue, what do you think was more important? Training soldiers for D-Day or preserving an 800-year-old village? The government's answer will shock you. Picture this scene. On the 1st of November 1943, with preparations for the Allied invasion of mainland Europe underway, the people of Imber were called to a meeting in the village schoolroom and given 47 days' notice to leave their homes. Imagine being told that your entire way of life, everything your family had built for 500 years, had to be packed up and abandoned in 47 days. But here's the truly heartbreaking part. They were told this was temporary. Various promises were made to the villagers that they would one day return once the war was won. 6 months, they said. Maybe a year at most. It was a lie that would last 80 years and counting. What followed was one of the most heartbreaking scenes in British wartime history. Blacksmith Albert Nash was reported to have been seen weeping over his anvil when the villagers were evacuated. This man had spent his entire life forging iron in this village. Now he had to watch it all crumble. Farmers had to sell livestock they had been breeding for generations. Children left their pets behind. Elderly residents were forced from homes they had never left. Just 1 week before Christmas, the Bell Inn closed for the final time, and the remaining villagers were forced to leave. By December 17, 1943, the last person locked their door and walked away. They believed they would be back by summer. Put yourself in their shoes. What would you take if you had 47 days to pack up a lifetime? What would you leave behind, thinking you would see it again soon? The moment the last villager left, Imber transformed into something unrecognizable. Imber was to be used by US forces to practice street fighting. American GIs flooded into the village using centuries-old cottages as target practice. The irony was devastating. These soldiers were training to liberate European villages from Nazi occupation. By destroying an English village that had never been occupied, The 800-year-old church of St. Giles became target practice. Cottages where children had played became rubble where soldiers learned to kill. But this was just the beginning of Imber's nightmare. By May 8, 1945, Europe had the victory. The war was over. The villagers packed their bags, ready to go home. They waited and waited, and the government's response was, too damaged to restore, still needed for training. Their lack of bitterness towards the authorities during the evacuation turned to a feeling of betrayal. But then what was the extensive damage that supposedly made Imber impossible to restore? Entire German cities were rebuilt from complete rubble. But a village with damaged roofs and broken windows? Apparently impossible to fix. The truth? The military had found Imber too useful to give back. It was the perfect training ground, remote, realistic, and now free. In 1961, following a rally and public inquiry into the possibility of villagers returning to Imber, it was decided that the village was to continue to be used for military activities. 2,000 people protested in 1961. The government's response was no. Today, 80 years later, Imber remains a living ghost story. On many nights, however, and certainly during most days, this sleepy ghost village is almost as busy as its living neighbours in wider Wiltshire, but with soldiers instead of families. Modern British forces still use Imber for urban warfare training. The same cottages where children once learned to walk are now where soldiers learn to fight, house to house, once a year, just once. The public can visit on Imber Day. Former residents, now in their 80s and 90s, make pilgrimages to see what's left. Some of the children evacuated in 1943 lived their entire lives and died without ever seeing their birthplace again. Interestingly, the village that was supposedly too damaged to restore has somehow been perfectly fine for 80 years of military use. Think about that. 80 years, 3 generations of families who could have called Imber home. 225 people sacrificed their entire world so soldiers could train for D-Day. Their sacrifice helped win the war. But 80 years later, that sacrifice has become a permanent exile. If you enjoyed this story, like and subscribe for more.